All tanks were ready by 5:30 a.m., but the rest of the Abteilung wasn't, and a bridge was still under construction. After sunrise, we advanced with 7 tanks from the Abteilung, led by Feldwebel Ulrich. The sun had just risen on the horizon, making it nearly impossible to see anything to the south. We bypassed the village of Romaniki, squeezed past it, and began crossing the small stream from which Russian tanks had attacked us the day before. While doing so, we came under intense defensive fire. I returned fire with my machine gun. It was a terrible situation, standing in open terrain, blinded by the glow of the rising sun, while the 2 tanks next to mine had already been destroyed. On top of that, the steering on my Skoda Supersport wasn't working properly. I was lucky to make it through. Frolich's vehicle suffered an engine failure somewhere behind us. Hiller was in tank H3 1 under Unteroffizier Hagerman. The lead of the 7th Company then clashed with Russian tanks. Feldwebel Ulrich stood just 2 meters away from a Christie tank, which fired a round directly into the machine gun position of the Skoda. The shell went straight through the loader's body. Another Christie rolled up from the right, but was hit by one of our tanks and burst into flames. Ulrich then used his gun to finish off the Russian soldier at an unprecedented distance of 300 meters. I spotted another Russian tank firing at us, but how was I supposed to hit it with my poor Czech optics, aiming straight into the sun? We didn't even have tracer ammunition, and without proper optics, I couldn't observe where my shots were landing. I gave up firing at that target. What happened next was utter chaos. No orders came from the Abteilung, only requests from the company. Oswald was issuing commands to his platoon, but forgot to turn off the transmitter. One after another, our tanks started going up in flames. In front of me, Feldwebel Ulrich and his crew were running between the burning tanks. His wild hair had fallen into his face, and his blue neckerchief hung loosely from the hook of his jacket. His driver was with him. I'll never forget the expressions on their faces. Oberleutnant Hiller and his tank were right behind me. Again and again, tank shells slammed into the dirt around us. With no orders coming from the Abteilung, Hiller asked what we were supposed to do. Hauptmann Stern bluntly replied, "The 5th is to break through." Hiller passed the order to the company. Oberfeldwebel Oswald realized how foolish the order was and simply ignored it. While I was still sweeping the edge of the forest with machine gun fire, I told Roland, the driver, to start the engine. The men inside a vehicle often don't realize how dangerous the situation is, which, in a way, is good. But I decided to tell them that this was an all-or-nothing moment, and we'd need a lot of luck to avoid getting hit. The many burning tanks around me didn't exactly inspire confidence. To boost my confidence, the engine refused to cooperate, and the steering on the left side wasn't working properly either. I drove toward Leonhardt's Panzer IV, which was parked behind a bush, and then pushed straight ahead across the boggy terrain. The old bucket churned through the mud at a snail's pace. About 500 meters away, in the shade at the forest's edge, I spotted a Russian tank firing into the mass of vehicles on our side. I fired one useless shot at it, but with less than a 1% chance of hitting. Even such a fat target had to be ignored to conserve ammunition. The other vehicles, instead of advancing as ordered, were now slowly pulling back. I stood completely alone at the front, near a narrow road, while hidden Russian troops unleashed a hail of machine gun fire at my turret. I returned fire with my own machine gun and managed to silence them briefly. They had riddled our fuel cans, tent squares, and the rolled-up coats and blankets we carried on the rear of the tank. It seemed the Russians had either withdrawn or ducked into their foxholes. I scanned my surroundings like a hawk being so exposed. I had no desire to meet their hand grenades or Molotov cocktails. Wilhelm Lope realized I was in trouble, and along with his loader, fired into the bushes next to me. Looking behind, I saw at least 3 burning tanks in the bushes. Another one was ablaze, and its thick black smoke drifted across the road. It's not a comforting sight in such a situation. Then Hiller called and ordered us to withdraw from the unseen enemy. But how was I supposed to do that in this wreck of a tank, with 3 men inside, when the terrain was so bad that even other tanks couldn't cross it in forward gear? I was furious, but orders are orders. Now it was up to me and the driver to get the bucket out as best we could. Between us and the bush where Leonhardt was stationed lay a wide open field, under fire from both sides. The Russians' 4.7-centimeter shells tore through our tanks like they were made of paper. I let Roland climb into the turret to scout a route across the treacherous ground. There was a large water hole we had to avoid. If we ended up in it, no one would be able to pull us out. We began reversing until we reached the bush where Leonhardt's Panzer IV was parked. We made it. I can't describe how relieved I was. What happened next is hard to put into words. As soon as the Panzer IV moved aside, we made another dash toward the rear. While doing so, an unseen enemy fired several shots at us from the left flank. Things were getting serious, and the old Skoda couldn't pull itself through the dirt. It was heartbreaking, like standing on a tray, waiting for the shell that fate had reserved for us. A tank next to us was hit by whatever was firing. At that moment, Reed called on us to take some of the wounded back with us. The doctor was running around, wounded in the arm by a shell fragment. I climbed out of the tank. Unteroffizier Mahler was lying on the ground, one leg missing, the other badly mangled. The doctor had already applied rubber tourniquets. It was a familiar sight. Mahler's face had turned yellow. He wouldn't survive the transport. Uffs. Walter Bethke was also lying there. He was luckier only, one leg full of shrapnel. With help from Zimmerman, Dreyer's driver, I placed Mahler on the engine deck of our tank. Bethke could still move and climbed up on his own. The staff surgeon, however, had already jumped back into his Panzer and was trying to flee. That made me incredibly angry. "Where the hell are you going?" I shouted. He pointed frantically toward the rear and disappeared. Just then, Oberfeldwebel Jupp Wellinghoff, who had been my classmate at Karolai Gymnasium, and a young Jeffreiter named Theseus jumped out of their Panzer IV and into a rainwater ditch at the edge of the field. At that moment, I heard their Panzer IV take several direct hits before bursting into flames. The Russians then shifted their fire onto us, probably using a 7.62 centimeters gun, firing shot after shot into the field. Jupp had 2 badly burned hands and a scorched face. I could see the raw flesh. Through the strips of skin hanging from his hands, I could see the damage. His left foot had been torn open by a grazing shot, and his boot was shredded. The young Jeffreiter was also wounded. My tank, the last one still operational, was moving. I ordered Brune to fetch an armored half-track to evacuate the wounded. He jogged off with his machine pistol, following our tank. Later, I learned that after catching up with the tank, my men headed back to Bolshansk. On the way, they were hit by a Russian anti-tank gun, which caused no serious damage, just punctured a few petrol cans on the back of the vehicle. Bethke wasn't hurt further. Once they arrived, Brune ensured Bethke was taken to the hospital and then approached Hauptmann Stern, asking him to send a few tanks back to assist us. Stern refused, so Brune decided to return on his own to help us. But he was spotted by Hauptmann Bergstaller and immediately sent back into the village. Bad luck. The field was now littered with burning tanks. I gave first aid to the young Jeffreiter, pulling scraps of fabric from the wound in his hip before applying a dressing. No one had any proper dressings left, so I used a piece of string to apply a tourniquet to Jupp Wellinghoff's heavily bleeding leg. Oberfeldwebel Bunzer was also moaning about his foot. He was loud, so I took a closer look, just a small flesh wound. I scolded him for making such a fuss over nothing. To distract him, I pressed a machine pistol into his hand and told him to keep watch for Russian infantry. At that moment, the Panzer IV exploded, showering us with metal fragments. The 7.62 centimeters gun was still firing. I decided that the three of us had to escape on foot. Jupp pulled himself together, and despite his mangled foot, managed to walk. I was amazed that little Theseus was still mobile, even though his hip wound was deep. I forgot to mention that earlier. Obergefreiter T. Meyer, from Herford, part of Bunzer's Panzer IV crew, and Obergefreiter Grothus from the 7th Company had passed by. Amid the chaos, I sent them and Zimmermann toward the rear. I took Jupp Wellinghoff under my arm, and together we hobbled toward Bolshansk. We hadn't gone far when machine gun fire erupted from the left and the forest on our right. We threw ourselves to the ground and crawled forward. I had to admire Jupp's determination. He kept going with his burned hands, which were now shedding bloody water, and his wounded foot. Bunzer and the young Jeffreiter also kept up. We crawled further and further, heads down, as bullets whistled overhead. Eventually, we reached a position about 400 meters in front of Bolshansk, which was still burning and smoking. Then, 300 meters ahead on the left, I spotted several figures. They wore steel helmets, but their greatcoats were too large to be ours. I used Bunzer's binoculars. Damn, they were Russians. A terrible tightening gripped my chest and stomach. We were cut off, surrounded. What a mess. What no? I thought about it. The situation couldn't be worse. We decided to stay low and wait. I scanned the area with binoculars. The Russians were spread out in a line across the route we needed to take. Their artillery was firing further to the right, which meant that area was still under our control. On the road behind us, where we had just been, columns of Russian infantry were marching. Tanks rolled toward the forest in front of column. Others turned their turrets toward the rear and moved toward Romaniki. We could now see the Russian tank that had fired on us earlier. We were cut off from both sides. Our only hope was that the Russian positions we had attacked yesterday with my platoon and Lopez's Panzer IV were still unoccupied. First, I crawled back, hoping to reach a burned-out Skoda tank on the road to the right. Maybe the wounded could hide beneath it. Or should we surrender? I was an officer, and the chances of surviving surrender were slim. The others might get out unharmed. I thought of Jupp Wellinghoff's wife in Osnabrück. No, I wouldn't surrender to the Russians as long as I had bullets in my pistol. While crawling toward the Skoda, I saw Grothus from the 7th Company running back. He stood behind the burned-out tank, and Zimmermann followed. Both still had their pistols and could defend themselves. Grothus's face was blackened and scorched. I approached them and sent them back. Jupp was behind me and asked what to do. I told him to pull himself together and join the others, who were withdrawing along a row of bushes ahead. I spotted Russian infantry examining the bodies of fallen German soldiers. It was time. I shouted to Bunzer to give me fire support. Zimmermann, Grothus, Jupp, and Theseus had reached a shallow ditch 200 meters behind us and were preparing to reach the forest in front of Kola. Were they mad? I had told them to head toward the area being shelled by Russian artillery. That drew Russian attention, and they opened fire on us. The Russians ahead took cover behind the burned-out tank and fired at me and Bunzer, who returned fire with his machine pistol. I crawled back toward the bushes and covered Bunzer as he jumped back to join me. He had emptied his first magazine. Someone was firing at us from the left, too. We had to retreat quickly. Bunzer's machine pistol jammed the magazine was stuck. The Russians were only 50 meters away. They began throwing grenades. I saw the green fragmentation rings of their stick grenades spinning through the air 5 meters too short. Thank God. Bunzer had jumped further back. I had to follow. On my stomach, I crawled through the shallow ditch. The bush was 50 meters away. That's where I needed to go. I didn't care anymore. I ran 10 meters, and the Russians opened fire like mad. I was standing on a serving tray. I threw myself into the grass and dragged my exhausted body forward. I couldn't breathe. Then, a hard blow to the back of my head. I took off my cap and touched my skull. It hurt terribly. No blood, but the cap had a hole where a bullet had passed through. My eyes flickered red, but I kept going. I reached the bushes and rushed to another ditch. The Russians on the right were getting dangerously close. Ahead, I saw men in black uniforms. Thank God they were ours. But I had to think about myself now. I started running across the rye field. The soil clung to my boots, weighing me down. It didn't matter. What followed was the worst, most terrifying 1,000-meter sprint of my life. Behind me, the Russians screamed and fired. Something fired at me from the left, but I was gaining distance. At 300 meters, I raced across the field with long strides. When I couldn't breathe anymore, I threw myself to the ground for a moment, then continued. Pistol in my right hand, binoculars in my left. I didn't care anymore. Bullets smacked into the ground around me. Others whizzed past my head. Never mind, I had to keep going. I reached a hollow and threw myself down, just deep enough to shed my coat. I took spare magazines from my pockets, stuffed maps into my trousers, and did the same with my calendar, notebook, and diary. In my gray turtleneck, I started running again. I was tempted when I saw horses running in the field, but I had no idea how to handle them. Better to rely on my own legs. I walked the next 100 to 200 meters to save my strength. The Russians hadn't kept up, but as I entered a sunflower field, fire from the left intensified again. Damn them, they couldn't hit anything anyway. I had to conserve my strength. Ahead, I saw the position we had attacked just a day before. I stared into the trees, but couldn't see a thing. The Russian positions had been abandoned. I jumped over a trench and approached a small stream running along the valley floor. A few long strides, and I was across. Another 100 meters, I climbed over a fence and disappeared into the trees. The Russians fired a few machine gun bursts in my direction, but I was safe now deeper in the undergrowth, just to avoid the chance of running into a Russian reconnaissance squad. Once inside the forest, I felt safe and protected. The instincts I developed playing cowboys and Indians in the woods back home, and later in the Boy Scouts, were now serving me well. I was proud of how silently I moved from bush to bush. I thought of home. Had my father ever experienced anything like this? After the war, I would marry. If I had a son waiting for me, even just a toddler, I'd feel calmer. I also thought about sports. During my army time in Freistadt, as a young lieutenant, I always wondered why the officers never exercised. Not a single one in the Abteilung could have kept up with my pace today. Soon I reached a small valley with a stream and a nearby pasture. It was peaceful. On the far side, birch and hazelnut trees glowed in autumn colors, with the occasional pine. It felt like a pleasant fall stroll. Suddenly, my eyes filled with tears. I didn't know why. I thought about how lucky I'd been these past few days. I clasped my hands and looked up through the treetops into the bright blue sky. I was praying, not like a Christian, not to Christ for saving me. I remembered what Wilhelm Lopez once said, that anyone out here on our side must be at peace with himself, must consider his life already over, and never expect help from anywhere. Man is too small to hope for divine intervention. Our daily experiences here show how insignificant our lives are, and how grateful we must be simply to exist. That knowledge should drive us to great deeds, to make ourselves worthy of life. I had learned how little the threat of death matters in moments like this. I didn't care anymore. I took off my cap and looked at the long tear a bullet had left in it. A few millimeters lower, and my name would have joined the other 17 officers killed in Russia. alongside the Prince of Ratibor in Poland and Schlegel in France. How small we humans are, and how little is lost when we die. I touched my lucky charm, my talisman. Looking at it gave me strength and warmth. Everything inside and around me had been shaken. I couldn't wait to get home. When I stepped out of the forest, I checked for tanks in the village of Pastoska. If they were gone, I'd have to find Camp Grupp behind the woods. From the forest's edge, I could see rooftops in Pastoska and Russians in Bolshansk. I had to keep moving. It was too dangerous to follow the forest edge, so I slipped back into the undergrowth. Suddenly, I saw a lorry, a license-built Ford, parked right inside the forest, engine running. I approached cautiously. The crew had to be nearby, but no one was in sight. Maybe there were weapons inside. On the load bed were a parachute and a leather flying cap German. If the pilot had fallen into Russian hands, he had no chance. There was also a box of sausages and another with cutlery. I took 5 small sausages in case I needed rations for a longer walk. I kept the flying cap as a souvenir. The white silk of the parachute tempted me. It would make a beautiful wedding dress, or something to wave if I ran into German troops, but I left it behind. I climbed a tree to scout the area. Tanks were rolling up the road toward Qom, and Russian infantry was there too. I walked another 30 minutes and stepped out of the forest again. Now I had a clear view of Pastoska, and yes, there were tanks and men among the trees. They were ours. I had made it. I ran into the field, waving like mad to avoid being shot by some nervous sentry. But then, what was that? A Russian lying in the field. Had they surrounded the village? No, those were corpses, mowed down by Wasmuth yesterday evening. Our men were approaching me. No one could believe it. Everyone patted my back, congratulated me. So many hands to shake. All the officers came, Lopez and Theo Langenbruck among them. They had already given me up for dead. Wilhelm Lopez was clearly shaken, close to tears. I tried to joke to cheer him up, but couldn't hide the bitterness in my voice when I asked if he really thought I'd leave him alone among this bunch of cyclists and no-opers. In the end, everything had turned out well. Roland and Brune, the loyal souls, and Muller, with the old comrades from the signals platoon, all came to say kind words. Feldwebel Ulrich was there with his driver. I had to tell the whole story to Major Lower, and I didn't hold back my criticism that no tanks had been sent to help us. He could read my feelings in my face. He tried to justify it by saying we had tied down the 101st Red Armored Division at Bolshansk, keeping the path to the Dnieper bridgeheads open for our troops. But what could a little man like me say to a Knight's Cross holder? I simply congratulated him on his prestigious success. After that, Wilhelm Lopez and I went to a well and washed up. We had some food. Then we watched as the Russians used their Christie tanks to tow away their damaged vehicles and our wrecked Skodas, including the command tanks of the 5th and 7th Companies, with all their valuable radio documents. Later, I went to visit the wounded